Next member of the panel is Dr. Jose Azel, who is the main academician of this organization, the Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami. We're very grateful to them for having to hold this conference here. Dr. Azel left Cuba as a political exile in 1961 when he was 13 years of age under the program known as Operation Peter Pan, a movement of children, refugees without their parents. Dr. Azel has devoted himself to the analysis of the economic, social, and political situation of Cuba with enthusiastic studies of Cuba after the arrival of Castro, and he's published extensively on subjects related to Cuba. A book entitled Tomorrow in Cuba, A Legacy of Castro and the Challenges for Transition. I recommend to all of you that you read it to know what has happened in Cuba better and the position of Professor Azel. Professor Azel is also a very active participant and a colleague of Professor Hrabczynski, who is the director of the Bacardi House, and he has had several activities as an assistant professor of international trade and business in the administration of the University of Miami. He has a bachelor's and master's degree in business administration and a doctorate in international affairs from the University of Miami. Professor Azel. Good afternoon to all of you. I always think that it is a bad idea to talk about economic matters after lunch, so I'm going to try to make this as pleasant as possible. Recently, I just read the book that Dr. Cole mentioned on, which we wrote with the cooperation of Menis and others, and I was struck in this chapter specifically as to how we agree with the analysis of the negative impact in Cuban society of these last 53 years of a totalitarian system, politically and an economy of command in the economic area. It has been a negative impact, a devastating impact, and from my way of looking at it, perhaps this is the worst legacy we're going to find when the real time comes for change and transition. We know very well the economic area. I don't think it's necessary to go into detail on Cuba of the 50s, a country which was relatively prosperous. Their economy was among the best in Latin America in its majority and among the highest in the world in many measurements that we could take. And a country that's extremely poor 53 years later. But perhaps the thing that hasn't been sufficiently studied, and we're only beginning to understand a little bit better over the last few years, is the impact, the sociological impact, the social impact, the psychological impact on a people during those 53 years of the totalitarian regime of oppression and submission or dependency. The impact is profound, and perhaps it will be the most important challenge in a free Cuba. Let us consider now one thought, that the work in Cuba no longer is the main way of earning your living. Work is no longer the means of earning your living, of helping our family. And what is the impact of that thought? What is the impact in a society where work stops having that reason? This is a profound impact, and it's difficult to turn around. I argue in my book, for example, that to a certain extent the Cuban people have made socialist values an internal value. In other words, they've become so accustomed to expect changes from above downward and not changes from the bottom up. In a democratic system, as we all know, the changes originate, in theory at least, from the bottom to the top. They originate with the people through their vote, their elections, elect their government, and the governments. But a totalitarian system, the changes always come from the top downward, and the people expect. They can't imagine that it's in the hands of the people for them to originate the changes. This is the result of this has not only been the problem of corruption, I could talk about that too, but cynicism and apathy within the Cuban people, with sentences such as change things to make everything all the same and things like that. In a survey taken recently, a couple of years ago, they asked people in Cuba what they would do if the economic reforms had not been carried out. And the answers were nothing. Nothing. In other words, the people has been accustomed to expect the changes from the top downward, and they've taken those values onto themselves. Now, this is a condition which we can't change right now. That is the reality. When change comes, whether it's tomorrow, in 2 years, 3 years, whenever the change comes, we'll find a civil society which, frankly, is not prepared to assume the responsibilities as to how a citizen should behave in a democratic system, in a market economy. They have not an opportunity. It's not a criticism, simply they haven't had the opportunity to practice how a citizen behaves. What are his responsibilities within the society? What are my duties? What are my obligations as a citizen? Unfortunately, the Cuban people have not had that opportunity to learn to behave that way. And what are we going to find? We're going to find a civil society, not an ideal one, where we're going to try to build a market economy and try to build a democratic system. Well, going on to this subject then, I started to explore a discipline, a sub-discipline of economics, to call it that, which has the name of behavior economics. And reading on this new discipline, it occurred to me, well, could we apply these modern techniques so that when the time comes we could design policies to induce better behavior of the citizens without ever taking away any freedom from people? I'm going to give you two examples of this technology. One is nice and the other one is more serious. And then later we can, in the questions and answers, see how we could use these ideas to create policies. For example, in a bathroom, in the gentleman's bathroom in the airport in the Scandinavian countries, there was a serious problem. Apparently the men, when they urinated, didn't point well and they urinated outside the urinal. This is a serious problem. The bathroom was close to the bar. Something was going wrong there. The totalitarian solution was a soldier there to make sure that they urinated properly. The solution of this technology, so as to say, was to paint a black mosquito in each one of the urinals. It turned out when there was a mosquito there, they pointed at it. They pointed at the mosquito. And that is a tactic. That is, how do you induce better behavior without taking any freedom away? We could not point at the flea if we didn't want to, but we did point at the flea. And the other subject, we all know that you have an accident, an automobile accident, in the United States, there is a waiting list, an extraordinarily long list waiting for donated organ of corneas, whatever. And many people among us, and I'm on that list, perhaps in informal conversation, we've expressed that if we were to die in an automobile accident, we would like our organs to be made available to save some life. But we never took the necessary steps to register that desire. And in the U.S., the law considers that if you are not a donor, you're not a donor unless you're registered, indicating that you're willing to donate your organs. The technical term is the status quo bias. In other words, if we haven't made the decision, it's in several European countries, they've changed the law, and it's considered by law that any persons are automatically donors, organ donors, unless they have said, I do not want to donate my organs. In other words, they're eliminated from the system. In other words, we've changed the policy. Now, we haven't taken anybody's freedom away, but the result has been 95% of the organ donors have increased, and the result has been many lives saved. That is an example of this technology, this behavior. How could we use this knowledge to design a change for Cuba? I'm going to comment on two economic policies that are rather controversial, but I like to be controversial. One of them is in the economic area, and perhaps when we get to it, it would be of interest to consider the dollarization of the Cuban economy. It's economic. You say, oh, you're crazy, that can't be done for many reasons, and they're right. It's not the ideal system. The ideal system would be one where there would be a central bank, an independent central bank, a prudent one, a trained bank with a prudent, trained government, competent government, but that's not going to exist. It will never exist for many years. So perhaps to dollarize the economy, even though I agree it's not the ideal system, and they would have to operate with a budget. They could print. Won't be able to. They can't print pesos. They can't print dollars as a methodology to induce their operating, sticking to their budget, because they don't have the recourse of printing pesos. That's one thing. In the political area, and this has never been done in any of our countries in Latin America, perhaps to consider not a presidential system based on the U.S. system, but a parliamentarian system, as many of the European countries have. Why? Because I love that idea of separating the head of the government from the head of state. The presidential system, as we all know, there's a single person there. But I think that the head of the government should be a boring man or woman who doesn't talk a lot but deals with the trains, making the trains arrive on time. And the head of state takes trips, but I'm delighted with that way of separating the two functions of government. Also, we have the characteristics in many Latin American countries that if the presidential system is 4 years or 5 years, and I don't like that 4 years, we can change them. And we do that through coup d'etats, and we do it illegally. The parliamentary systems, it means if we want to change them every week, we can change the government every week, but at least within the constitutional framework. In other words, represent this as an argument of superiority of the parliamentary system over the presidential system. It's been operating for 200 years, but I'm presenting it as a way of inducing a better behavior of citizens so that the government will have certain limits. And I'm fascinated also by this spectacle that we see when we see the parliamentarians insult one another. The government, this has never been any opportunity to have debates like that. That would be fascinating. Of course, there are problems. For example, when the revolution in Poland started the electoral process, there were 200 political parties. And I said, well, why was that? The problem is that you have two Cubans together, you have three political parties already. Yours, mine, and ours. It doesn't matter. And I think even though my thoughts in my book are rather pessimistic, in the first chapter as to describing a civil society which hasn't had any opportunity to practice, citizens practice. There are ideas, concepts, which perhaps, if we were to implement them and apply them with a design, would help us to combat this legacy, this sad legacy that Mr. Castro has left us.